Is your ox getting gored? Have you ever been in a situation where a government introduces a new rule to slow down or overregulate your business activity? Few people are as well trained on real estate and government law as attorney Tim Davis, which make him the perfect champion for property owners who have struggled under some oppressive policies introduced by cities and governments as the short-term rental industry has surged in popularity in the past 15 years. Tim has always been my go-to guy for myself and my team when government overreach forces private citizens to stand up and pay to defend their own rights. He was born in a small town, but journeyed to Oxford, one of the best law schools in the world, to be trained by the best in economy, business, and law. He's my friend and a faithful champion of real estate property owners, undefeated in my book, The Sultan of Statutes. Get ready for Tim Davis. And so here you are from this area, and Oxford accepts you. Do you think it was just based on your credentials, or do you think they wanted to moonlight with a kid from Missouri?
No, I think it was based on my credentials. The tutors who made the admission decision had no incentive to have someone from rural America.
And they don't think they don't think that these Brits were like, all right, let's see how this guy does.
No, I don't think so.
It's all based on merit and education.
Yeah, if they want to get people from low-income rural areas, there are plenty of places in the north of England they could draw from.
Yeah. So what was your experience like then at Oxford?
Oh, I loved it. It was stressful, but I loved it. So first I was taken in by the architecture of being in England. Well, of course, the architecture is hundreds of years old. The building I lived in was built in the 1700s. There's nothing like that around here.
You seem to like architecture. Like even in some of your travels, you've talked about, Greece, you talked about Macedonia, places you love to go. Why do you think you like architecture?
I enjoy art and architecture. I enjoy color. I enjoy things that are beautiful. It's not something I tried to do. It's just something innate. So
you went to Oxford based on the merits of the school and ended up finding beautiful things over in England.
Yes. So I like the school, the structure of Oxford, the colleges, the buildings, the gardens. The gardens are spectacular. And then the culture of being able to go to the museums. The university itself has phenomenal museums, the Ashmolean, the Pitt Rivers, the Bodleian Library itself is a phenomenal museum. And then if you wanted any shows, you could go into London. You could just hop on the bus out in front of your college. In an hour and a half, you'd be in central London. You could take in shows in the West End. Or you could go to most of the museums in London are free. So you could go to the British Museum or the Tate Modern, or the Victoria and Albert, the National Gallery, and so on.
How did you know you like to go to museums? Because in Branson, there's only like fire engine museums and classic car museums, tractor museums. Were your parents really instrumental in getting you to go to museums, or is this just something new that you discovered as a young adult?
I think I discovered it probably in graduate school. Keep in mind, I didn't go to Oxford straight out of Branson High School.
Gotcha.
From Branson High School, I went to undergrad in Canada.
Okay.
4 years undergrad, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Toronto, where I did a master's and PhD in economics. And Toronto and Ontario in general have excellent museums. Ottawa has great museums. Okay. Montreal has excellent museums.
That's where it came from. I see. I didn't know about the Canada, John.
Yeah, so we've got a long interval.
Okay.
Of say 11 years from the time I left Branson High School to the time I started at Oxford was an 11-year period. Okay. 4 years for undergrad, 7 years for grad school.
Okay. I've talked to a lot of attorneys, and they say just about real estate, and it seems like a lot of the laws that the United States still practices came from tenant landlord law over in England.
Yeah, almost all of our commercial law and property law comes straight from England. It's not as if the constitutional law as well. It's not as if the United States just invented its own laws. Keep in mind, the United States was governed by England for nearly 200 years.
Right.
And so the foundation of it, and when the American Revolution happened, we didn't just throw out our entire legal system. It was the only legal system we had.
Right.
And we just continued. The legal system basically continued the same. The only change was who was at the top of it. Was it the king in England and the parliament in England, or was it the United States government?
So what do you feel the advantages would be for you, business and real estate attorney, for going to Oxford where other people may not have?
It seems to me that the legal training in England focuses on basics, the foundations of law, as it were, more than American systems. So the English system is going to focus much more on property, contracts, torts, and trusts. Those are, as it were, the building blocks of everything else that happens. The United States, U.S. law schools don't seem to focus to the same extent on those building blocks. So, for example, 40% of my classes at Oxford dealt just with contracts. So I come out of there with a much more sophisticated understanding of contract law than, say, someone who went to a U.S. law school and just took one contract class their first year, which sometimes happens. People just take one contract class their freshman year, and that's it. So they graduate from law school, and basically they have a very rudimentary understanding of contract law, if not an outright misunderstanding of it. And the same in property. Probably 30% of my classes in Oxford just dealt with concepts of property, real estate, real property, and personal property. Whereas in the U.S., you might get one class, maybe two.
And a lot of experience that I've had with you, a lot of attorneys that I've talked to, they just quote opinions, but you're always quoting or emailing statutes or case law. I've definitely noticed that different about you. You're very data driven, it seems to be, in your approach to the clients that you take and the cases that you accept. What was your interest in law? Why did you choose this as a career?
Well, I was just curious about it. Many people choose a career, I think they do, based on what they think they can make money out of or what their family's in. I studied economics just because I loved it. So that was the first 11 years of my college, was just studying economics and finance, just because I found it so fascinating.
In fact, your book was like an economic-based book, wasn't it?
That's true. My doctoral dissertation won an award called the Joseph Dorfman Prize, which basically means it was the best doctoral dissertation in my area in the world in that field of economics.
Congrats.
Yeah. And then after I had won that award, Cambridge University Press came to me and said, "Would you please write for us a book on economic policy?" I said, "Yes, I'll be glad to do it." So I took my doctoral dissertation and developed it further, adding information that I got from the Bodleian Library in Oxford and from the archive, primarily from the archive of the Bank of England, to talk about how monetary and fiscal policy developed 200 years ago, essentially. So what we see the Federal Reserve doing today and what we see the U.S. Treasury doing today in terms of policy largely mimics ideas that were developed by the Bank of England and key leaders in Parliament 200 years ago. Quite fascinating.
Truly. What are your opinions on the current state of the economy? Anything worth sharing based on your economic expertise?
Yeah, the U.S. has a solid foundation. We have a well-established legal system, well-established system of property rights, a court system that does a pretty good job defending those property rights. We have moderate taxation. The monetary policy of the Fed, the past 3 years accepted, has been excellent. Since at least the late 1970s, the Fed has pursued an excellent view of monetary policy. After the Fed was converted by Milton Friedman to become monetarists, and we're doing pretty well. My one complaint about the U.S. policy, my chief complaint about U.S. economic policy at the moment is that in early 2021, when it was obvious that the economy was recovering from the COVID shutdown, that the Fed continued to expand the money supply in a way that did nothing to increase employment or output, but only triggered inflation. It seems strange because this was coming from a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress who were providing the impetus for this increase in the money supply. And yet the people who were most injured by this policy, the people who were most injured by inflation, are people on fixed incomes. So people who are elderly, people who are poor, people who are doing what you might think of the lowest jobs in the labor market.
People who can only put $5 worth of gas in their gas tank at a time because they can't afford to fill it up. The money's not there.
That's right. Those are the people who the Democratic Party has traditionally thought about as being their base, or the people they're caring for the most. Those are the people who are most injured, in fact, by the first-year policies of the Biden administration in cranking up the money supply when there was no need for it, for one, and then when it only generated inflation. In fact, from the start of 2020 to the end of 2021, the monetary base in the United States increased by 35%. left unchecked, that increase in the monetary base was going to trigger inflation of 35%, roughly, over a 2 to 3 year period. Somehow, everyone should have known this. It's not as if the way monetary policy functions is a mystery. It's the functioning of monetary policy has been well understood for over 200 years. Somehow, at the end of 2021, the Fed then realizes we really screwed this up. So we're going to have to start selling. The reason the interest rates are going up now, the Fed is having to sell bonds back into the market to pull some of that money supply out of the banking system. Well, they should have started that in early 2021. Had they started in early 2021, we wouldn't be in this situation today. They could have kept inflation in check. We wouldn't have had any inflation problem. But now the Fed just overloaded the banking system with free, loose cash, as it were, during the COVID pandemic, that now they're having to sell bonds back into the market to pull money out of the banking system. And that's why we're seeing these high interest rates.
Do you see them continuing up?
I don't know that they'll continue up. I think our current inflation rate's about 5%. Inflation had been running 9 or 10% before the Fed began putting the brakes on. Currently, we're at about 5% inflation. And I think the Fed most recently, either this week or maybe next, they're going to ratchet up the interest rate probably another 0.25%. And so we'll at least continue these high interest rates at least through 2025. The Fed doesn't have a choice. They've got to get this surplus cash out of the banking system.
Well, we've all gotten drunk on low interest rates for the past few years, and a lot of people have built a lot of wealth through that. And I remember the first house that I bought, it was 7% interest, so we can function pretty well as a society with those interest rates. It's not like rampant inflation or the Weimar Republic in Germany where, people are with wheelbarrows of cash. Do you see it going that direction, or do you think that the folks at the head of the Fed are smart enough to be able to stop things?
The Fed will keep it in check.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for your opinions on that. It's always good to have a scholar's opinion on what's going on because a lot of us don't have somebody like you in our life. And I'm so thankful that I do have you in my life because you have been just a huge ally to me. You've been a friend to me, and you've always jumped in to encourage and advocate me but as you know that I've jumped in to encourage and advocate for my clients. I mean, we really met through a mutual friend. Aaron Schaffner was the first person that ever mentioned your name to me. Really great guy, loves to work on investments, loves real estate. And so you were the guy that he, went to. Aaron Schaffner was the guy who, when I first started real estate, my first year of real estate, he would see me in the office trying to think my way to success. And he'd look at me like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm just trying to figure this all out. And he's like, come with me. And we would go into properties, and he really showed me that I should be out in the inventory, previewing the properties so that I could speak intelligently about the property with people I haven't met yet. And that was an eye-opener for me. And we also played this game called Gone in 30 Days. So we would walk into a house. There's a lot of vacant houses in Branson because it's a second home market. So we would walk into a house, we'd look at it, and we'd say, gone in 30 days price. And shooting from the hip, we would have to both come up with the price, and then we would track it to kind of see who was closest. So it was a really fun kind of competition. It helped me be able to price homes really, really fast and shoot from the hip if I needed to. I don't always prefer to do that. I know you don't either, but sometimes you have to. I really respected him, and he recommended you. And I even remember the first thing that I called you on was like not even significant. It wasn't even really worth your time anyway. But I don't like to mess around with people who don't know what they're doing, or weed my way through attorneys until I can find a good one. But then once I realized who you were, and that a fascinating thing about you is it was almost a pro bono thing that you were doing that I heard about that you had done, and you had just kind of jumped in, and it was just something that you had done for someone in your community, somebody you knew, somebody you went to church with. You just jumped in and defended the person because they were wronged, and you had just done this sort of pro bono thing for them that ultimately you had told me that story as well. And I was like, man, what a great guy. It's also interesting. I mean, I grew up in St. Louis, and there's a lot of people in government in towns like that. Not so much here. There's not a lot of people in government. And so those relationships are really very significant. I teach people all the time in my classes, like if the planning and zoning people don't know your name, you're not buying enough real estate. You're not going to enough meetings to be able to defend your clients or support your clients or know what's going on, in town for that fact. But it was always fascinating to me that you, even in a small town, were not afraid to stand up to your own government and defend the rights of your clients. And a lot of people wouldn't do that because you are from around here.
That's true.
And in a small town, that matters. Because outside attorneys might go in front of a judge and they don't know. No one knows them. And recently in my time in the courtroom, I've gotten to realize that you all know each other. For you guys, meaning you attorneys, it's not personal. There is no real personal interactions between you two because you might be working together on the next case. There's a real interesting sense of collaboration and camaraderie while you're also advocating for your individual clients. And I admire it. And I just admire the fact that you're not afraid to stand up to your own government, being from around here, Not many people would do that, but you seem to with great confidence. So tell us about that.
I don't remember that particular case, but I'm often working against the governments in the local counties or the cities that exist in the local counties. One, it benefits my clients, and my clients pay me for that. And then two, I really enjoy it.
What do you like about it?
Well, it's important that the constitutional restraints that exist on the exercise of state power are enforced now and then, just to remind the government that there are elected officials. They themselves are subject to the law. They don't get to do whatever they want.
You are a Constitution man. You are a superhero. You are. You don't know it. It's true, though. And there's a passion behind that. So is there anyone else like you that also believes that? Or is this sort of unique to you and sort of a core belief of yours?
No, I'd say most of the good litigation attorneys have a fairly comprehensive grasp of the Constitution, at least as it applies to their area of law, and are passionate about it.
So does it happen a lot in your experience?
Constitutional issues come up in probably half of my cases at least. I'm dealing with the government a lot, dealing with real estate a lot. Here's how it comes up, and many listeners may not think of this, but if you read the United States Constitution, there's no mention anywhere of cities or counties. And yet, the Constitution defines how all political power is divided in the U.S. So the question is, how is it that the local government that we deal with, which is the level of government that most affects our lives and that can be most intrusive in our lives, how does that local government have the authority to do anything? And here's how it comes about. That the states have the ability, if they want, the state level of government has the ability, if it wants, to carve out some of its powers and to delegate those to a local level of government to implement. And we happen to be in Taney County, next door is Stone County. There are a few incorporated cities in these counties. The only reason those levels of government have any power is because the state of Missouri has carved out very limited powers from its basket of what it can do. It's carved out in a very limited way some of those powers and delegated them to the local county and to the cities. And so a large part of my practice is just reminding everyone that the local government and the local officials can't do whatever they want. But the powers that they can exercise are clearly defined by the state legislature in statute, both the substantive powers that they have, and then the procedures by which those powers can be exercised is also well defined. And if they get outside of that, which local governments are wont to do, that they've done something they had no authority to do that's inherently what's ultra vires, it's called, and void. And there's no reason a person who lives in the area should be subject to a void action that their local government has no authority to take.
I have experienced this firsthand, and I'm so glad to have a champion like you in our county because this has been rampant, not just in our county, but in counties all across America, especially as the short-term rental business has really surged in popularity. And a lot of times we're taught, I'm always taught, I'm a Gen Xer. I know my parents were always taught to respect authority. And especially in a small rural town, we also have to respect authority. It's bred into us. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I feel like either local government isn't as educated as they need to be on the topic, as sensitive to the major economic and trickle-down effect of their decisions, or they're sometimes power hungry and just want to feel powerful. So they overreach. And I have seen more instances of government overreach as it pertains to the short-term rental business, not just government overreach, but corporation overreach. In the instance where a city utility department will charge an extra fee simply because it's quote unquote commercial without any defining characteristics of commercial. Mm-hmm. So now if you want the privilege to operate a nightly rental, you now have to pay a $900 tap fee, even though the tap is already there and you're just renting your home for a period of less than 30 days. Mm-hmm. You know, it's also interesting to me how economically it's not money that defines how a property should be taxed, because I might buy a property and rent it out for a period of 6 months to a year, and it's part of my bundle of rights as a renter. If I decide to rent my property for a period of less than 30 days, now all of a sudden I have to pay sales tax on it. It's not the act of making money that determines whether I pay sales tax. It's state statute that determines that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't know that. Mm-hmm. And our local government didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk about some of their tactics here in a minute. But what has ended up happening all across America is that private citizens are having to pay an attorney to defend their rights, which are already afforded to them by the Constitution.
Yes.
And this is rampant. So what do we do about it, Tim?
I don't know that there's an option, because local governments, and this is not something unique to our area, but it seems like many local governments, people get elected and then imagine that now that they've been elected, that they can do whatever they want. They can pass whatever local ordinance they want. They can prosecute whatever they want. They can criminalize whatever they want. And that's simply not the case. Or that they can interpret the statute, the statutes that empower them to tax, for example, they get to interpret these however they feel like interpreting them in the moment. And then there doesn't need to be any consistency in the interpretation of a taxing statute, that you could interpret a taxing statute differently from one county to the next, even though it's the same statute, or from one city to the next. And unfortunately, the only way to hold that in check is to actually litigate against them, which means you hire legal counsel to push back on government overreach.
So let's talk about this in some way and give people some strategies. So here's just a couple of different examples of what I've witnessed in my experience. So first of all, 2017, 2018, I went to the state legislature to fight with a small band of people to defend short-term rental owners' rights to rent their property for a period of less than 30 days. It was a very interesting and eye-opening experience with government, and it was just state government. But it was fascinating to me how corporations have so much influence over even our state legislators. So in this case, Expedia had hired a lobbyist to introduce a bill to protect short-term rental owners. I'll use the word protect in quotes. And here's what was confusing about it. So Expedia had purchased HomeAway Inc. at that time, which was the ownership, the company that owned VRBO.com. It used to be a mom and pop company when I started selling short-term rentals, but now it's mega corporation, Expedia, right? Because Expedia owned that marketing platform for short-term rental owners, they introduced legislation that made it look like they were protecting short-term rental owners, but only 7% of their revenue annually would come from the short-term rental business. The rest of it came from hotels. So the hotels had lobbied strongly against short-term rentals because they wanted to quote-unquote level the playing field. And it confused all of the state legislators, and it was very difficult for me, one, to get any of my clients or my entrepreneurs, and in some cases even my agents, to show up and help with that effort. I literally donated my time going to Jeff City to do it, but I was so passionate, like you are, about the violation of the rights that were occurring for people that I had brought into this industry. And so I felt like I owed it to my clients to be able to do that. And in that, I learned that it's really difficult to convince anybody of anything at the state level. And it's very easy to confuse state legislators. And lobbyists are fascinating at it. And we ultimately decided in that battle that local government should prevail, because there's no way we could have created a statewide form of government or regulations that would have protected Taney County and Lake of the Ozarks. those are rural areas. And regulations in Kansas City and St. Louis would have destroyed our economy. So I was standing up for also our economy in Taney County. Tourism drives most of our economy. So I was standing up for that reason. And for a while, we experienced a win. And then slowly that local economy started to pick up. We got a new assessor in that decided she wanted to change the way short-term rentals were taxed. That's another instance. We have utility companies charging extra rates. We have a complete moratorium, for a while on short-term rentals until the county decides how they want to regulate them. We have and again, this isn't new to me, but at the time, a few years ago, we had new regulations that would pop up where now we need a merchant's license in order to operate, or we need a permit of some kind. Retroactive code issues, like I buy a property, I want to use it as a short-term rental. Now I have to retrofit the property with a sprinkler system, a fire suppression system. You know these. I mean, we talk about these all the time. And so these are just examples of things that could come up and might come up in your area if you're listening from an area that there's no regulations. I promise you that regulations will come, and what to do about it. And it happens to me all the time. Because of that battle, people contact me all the time and are like, hey, I've got a city council meeting. What do I say? Or they're trying to place a ban on short-term rentals in this county. What should we do? There's no leadership, even nationwide, to advocacy in the short-term rental space. So I'd like to, now that we've shared a little bit of what can happen, what do we do when it does?
What you reference, at least in part, is a concept called regulatory capture. That is where large business interests attempt to capture the kind of regulation that would be imposed by a state or by the federal government. And they're trying to capture control of that regulation, not to protect consumers, certainly, but to exclude competitors, especially an attempt to capture the regulatory control so as to exclude small competitors. That can happen in many industries. And it just shows one of the risks that the more government expands, the more the scope of government expands, the greater the risks for the abuse of that power.
Which is fascinating to me, why we live in a very conservative Republican area, but yet the regulations they were imposing on short-term rentals were more government, broader government. But what I found is that for the most part, these people and our elected officials are smart and good people. They've done a lot of good for our county. So I'm not talking bad about them, but in some cases, I feel like they've been overwhelmed by the popularity of an industry. So they have a knee-jerk reaction, and they have to react violently in some cases just to manage their day-to-day. And so in those cases, I've had some luck just holding meetings with people and saying, hey, can we not do a knee-jerk reaction here? But in a lot of cases, they do it anyway. And it's frustrating for a lot of people, especially when they invest a lot of money in a piece of real estate and now all of a sudden something's changed, or they can't do it, or they get a cease and desist letter, because they haven't turned in their fire suppression system plans, and so those things happen. And what I found in my conversations with people all around the country is that the best cities that have come up with the most progressive and cooperative legislation has been where first they must show a compelling governmental interest. This is Arizona they came up with this at their state legislature. Any regulation imposed must show a compelling governmental interest, so a reason to make that regulation. It should be narrowly tailored, and it should regulate by the least restrictive means, not the most restrictive means, meaning that people in Branson, Missouri, if they didn't want to put a fire suppression system in their home, they would just have to disclose to the guest using the home that there's no fire suppression here. Great. Is that okay? We have an agreement. Let's go ahead and rent to you. But the most restrictive means would be the most expensive. And I mean, it gets ridiculous sometimes because in addition to a fire suppression system, sometimes the size of the main coming into the property has to even be increased in size.
Oh, it does. Yes.
And you
can even have public water access public water service to your house, but yet the pipe isn't a sufficient diameter.
So there's a lot of ways that a government can try to manipulate. And so that's kind of what I want to get to the bottom of is, in addition to anything that you'd like to say about short-term rentals and law and how we can equip good entrepreneurs with the tools they need to defend their rights, how do we also recognize when malice is being, presented for the purposes of one industry, like say the hotel industry versus the short-term rental industry? So again, we continue to learn from you here today, Tim. So what can investors learn to defend themselves?
Well, in terms of recognizing malice, you can suspect malice. You can suspect that a certain regulation is being promoted for an improper means. The improper means being to exclude competition from the existing economic and political powers, so that they have less competition. Proving it's an entirely different matter.
Right.
Proving it can be much harder.
Right.
So the real challenge comes in proving it. If you found a smoking gun somewhere,
yeah,
and saying here's the text or here's the email to the city council member talking about how they can shut down their competitors by imposing this regulation, that would be wonderful to find. I've never had that happen. That we never found a smoking gun. You could just only infer its existence. Sometimes I've attacked legislation or regulations by showing how they're inherently anti-competitive. It doesn't mean that the regulation goes away, but you might be able to win that one court case for your client, showing that the regulation is inherently anti-competitive.
Well, for example, we can talk about this case because it's in the past, but when one of our local counties decided to completely ban short-term rentals, this was many, many years ago. You were instrumental in the case, and actually one or two investors, or a number of them, got together and sued the county. And what ended up happening was that the entire county's zoning department was dismantled because you had shown that it wasn't even properly established.
That's true. That was Stone County. That was quite gratifying. And it happened about this way because again, keep in mind, under the United States Constitution, Stone County has no inherent powers. The U.S. Constitution doesn't mention Stone County anywhere.
Correct.
The Stone County only has any kind of authority to act because the state of Missouri carved out part of its sovereignty and delegated that to the county. And so what Stone County had done is ignoring both the substantive powers that had been granted to them and ignoring the procedures to exercise those powers. The county commission in Stone County had invented its own system of land use controls. They weren't alone in this.
Performance zoning.
Well, it worked this way, that whatever you wanted to do with your land, you'd have to go into the county office and say, I want to do this with my land. If the county office deemed that you were simply continuing the same kind of uses in the land, then you didn't need a permit or anything else. You just continued on. There was no criteria to determine whether you were going to change the use of the land. And it was totally arbitrary. So typically, if you were a relative of someone in the county government, or a business associate of the county government, of someone in county government, or had just lived in the neighborhood for a long time, you could go in and whatever you wanted to do was deemed not a change in use. It was deemed a continuation of the same existing uses, and you could just keep doing whatever it was without a permit. By contrast, if you were from out of the area, especially an educated and more successful person from out of the area wanting to invest, then typically your project was deemed a change in use, no matter what it was. And keep in mind, the counties had no record of historical uses, and the counties had no criteria for determining when one use changed to another. Mm-hmm. And even no categories of what different uses might be.
No records or poorly kept records of any kind.
Actually, no records of what uses had been. It was purely an arbitrary decision by unelected officials who happened to work in the planning and zoning office. But that was true in not just in one county, but in several counties. And then, what even better, suppose that the local official said, yes, this is going to be a change of use. Then you submit an application form and an application fee. You go before an unelected body, the Planning and Zoning Commission, you say, this is our plan. And they decide whether they like your plan or not. Doesn't matter what it is. There are no criteria to determine whether they like it or not.
And in some cases, even if there is criteria, they still may not like it.
Oh, that's right. So Taney County, for example, had this score sheet where they would arbitrarily assign plus or minus points to your proposal. But if you got a minus score, that didn't mean it was voted down. If you got a plus score, it didn't mean it was approved. So you could get a very high plus score, meaning the county, by its own alleged criteria, kind of liked the project. They could still vote it down, primarily if you were from out of the area or if the neighbors objected.
Public hearings, that sort of thing.
There was
if people show up with knives and pitchforks and protest your use, then it's probably not going to happen.
You're going down in flames. If enough neighbors come out, you're going down in flames.
Yes, that's true.
This is just unconstitutional on so many levels.
Right,
It's
exactly.
inherently arbitrary.
Yes.
And so what I found very gratifying, instead of getting that case tried in a local court, I had that case transferred up to Franklin County, which is outside St. Louis. And then they were, as soon as we got into Franklin County, the local government was dead in the water, because no judge in a more sophisticated jurisdiction is going to tolerate that kind of abuse of power.
And it removes the opportunity for that local tribal government to continue to engage.
Absolutely, it does.
You're taking them to the principal's office for the most part, right?
That's right. We're going out to talk to some adults.
Yes, to have.
We've had a fight on the playground.
Yeah.
Now we're going to go talk to the adults.
This needs to be a legal
up in
fight, not a political
up
fight.
in St. Louis or Kansas City, right?
That was a good move.
Yeah.
And it's well known in the area, which is probably why you get a lot of business. And people that don't know should know. There should be songs sung in around campfires for Tim Davis, who protects the people.
Thank you.
But it really is admirable. So, and I know there's some cases we can't talk about because they're current. So let's say that somebody lives in a city, rural or not, and there's either a ban being imposed, or there's a density restriction being imposed, or an aggressive permitting process. What's the first step that somebody should take?
From my perspective, my first step is to see, does the local government have the authority to do this? And if so, if they claim they have the authority, where does that authority come from?
Where do they find it?
Well, you could go and ask. If you get a cease and desist letter, or if you get some sort of demand letter from your local government or your local fire district or your local sewer or water district, that letter had to come from somebody. So you go find the person who sent you that letter and say, what authority do you have to make this demand on me?
Okay.
We had an interesting case in the city of Branson. The city of Branson had demanded that some of my clients do certain things. And I went back to the city and said, well, I understand what you're asking of us, but where do you get the authority to make that demand? And then we haven't heard from them. That was, I guess, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. So we then
still waiting. So maybe they're looking it up. Maybe they know and they don't want to tell you.
That's right.
But or maybe they're just developing the suspense to make the story even better.
Yes, it would be nice. It would be nice to think that it was just to add, just because of artistic flair
so,
on the government side.
It is Branson, so we like art. So that's the first tactic that somebody can use.
Yeah.
Then what?
And then maybe just try ignoring them. I some of my clients, I say, well, yes, the government sent us this nastygram, this letter. Let's just ignore them and see what happens. And maybe they'll do something, and maybe they won't do anything.
Well, in some cases, I've even seen regulations imposed that there's absolutely no way a county could enforce them. Mm-hmm. They don't have the budget, the manpower, or the ability. Mm-hmm. They typically just leave it to the neighbors to enforce any regulations, which in turn perpetuates the tribal nature of the government, right? Mm-hmm. Because you just have one neighbor that doesn't like what you're doing. I remember I went to a planning and zoning meeting, and I was turning my home into a short-term rental. And I had most of the neighborhood show up to oppose me, but the neighbors immediately right next to me showed up, and they said, look, this guy takes great care of his property. Look what all he did to his property before he rented it out. He painted the property. He always keeps the grass mowed nicely. The shutters are painted. I saw him out there fixing the air conditioner. And by the way, there's $200,000 of cars in the driveway renting this property. You know, it's not people that are out trying to destroy my property. They said, we don't have a problem with it. I ended up getting that. But it's just amazing to me how not just neighborhoods, but cities also will make fearful decisions. Mm-hmm. Why do you think fear is so rampant?
It seems like when in the political arena, fear is a great motivator. I don't know why that is, but it seems to be. You think of how political campaigns come on. vote for the general theme is vote for me because my political opponent is going to harm your children or destroy your schools or destroy your neighborhood or they're going to release criminals onto the street, in large numbers.
Take away Medicare, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just somehow, and I don't know why, fear seems to be a very effective motivator in the political arena. And that's true here too. So often and we've seen this many times. When planning and zoning decisions are being made and they're being discussed, people come from the local community come out and say, well, if this project goes through, we're going to be inundated with sex offenders. We're going to be inundated with people drag racing in the streets. We're going to be inundated with all, wild parties and drug use.
Fear.
None of it's at all realistic when you're renting a nightly rental home, a luxury home for $1,000 a night.
Well, here's a case in point.
Yeah.
When there's a local subdivision that decided to change this is Branson Creek, changed in mid-stride. So they were originally designed to be sold as short-term rentals,
Mm-hmm.
but then a large majority of people that live there don't do that. So they called the county, said, by what authority do you have to do this? And the county didn't even have the records that it had been approved as a Division 3 short-term rental, approved area. So because the county kept poor records, it kind of worked against the short-term rental owners in that case.
That's right.
And so I showed up at the public hearing just to defend their right to rent. And I had gone to the sheriff's department and I had asked them, I said, can you give me a report just from this date to this date? And it was like almost a 8-month period of the number of times that the sheriff had been called to this subdivision because of some type of disturbance. And it was 0 times.
Mm-hmm.
And they were standing up there trying to say that this was going to cause this, horrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it never had.
No.
In fact, what had happened was the one person who was a very persuasive person. That's all it takes in a neighborhood, right? To get everyone riled up is she was sitting at the pool and 16 people walked up at one time. And it was a family that had just wanted to use the pool, but she didn't have the pool to herself anymore. But yet she was retired and she had the means and the money and the time on her hands to defend her opinions, which ultimately didn't work out. But the process changed. Rather than someone just being able to do short-term rentals there, 30 people had to go through public hearings and special use permit processes just to be able to get those out there. And the county itself created more work for itself by keeping poor records, and it was a mess. It actually left a bad taste in people's mouths in the community about short-term rentals. I think short-term rentals have such a horrible public relations campaign. There's nobody out there talking about some of the benefits, the ancillary jobs that are created for single moms and for the local repair guy, the money that it's injected into our community. Now, there are some things that I do begin to have opinions about on the other side. I mean, I do think affordable housing in second home markets is an issue, and I want to talk to you about that. And also, I feel like for the most part, a lot of investors have jumped into the short-term rental business because they want money, not because they want to be a good host. And so I think we're going to see a little bit of change there. But for the most part, the investors that I've worked with are just average people. They're not super wealthy. They're people who are trying to make something out of themselves and build a little bit of freedom, because real estate is one of the only ways we have as the middle-class people, upper middle-class people, to be able to get freedom, financial freedom. It's the only way that I know of, other than some YouTube side hustle, It's been great that you have been a champion for that person, that middle-class person that just is being abused by a government. So I saw you brought some notes. So what else did you want to talk about in terms of things that might help short-term rental?
The notes I have pertain to if people are thinking about going into the short-term rental business, some of the risks that exist out there and some of the pitfalls.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
And so initially, say starting 15 years ago or 20 years ago, when the short-term rental industry began to take off, at least it began to take off in this area. I'm sure it existed in some form on the coasts and in bigger areas before us. But once Branson got in the game, people were buying existing homes and converting them to nightly rentals, converting the use. Maybe the home wasn't changed that much, but the use of that home, instead of being a single-family home where people lived full time. They would now be a single family home where people would live for shorter periods less
30
than 30
days
days
or less, right? Yeah.
For the investor who's thinking about that's the kind of home that I'm interested in buying, you can make money off virtually any property as long as you know about the risks and the expenses that are going to be forthcoming up front on the front end. So, for example, if you know you're going to have to retrofit the house with a sprinkler system up front, if you know that you're going to have to upgrade the septic system, if you know that you're going to, maybe have to increase the diameter of the water line coming to the house, if you know all of that before you buy the house, then that's really not a problem. You just adjust for all of those things in the purchase price.
Put that in your pro forma.
That's right. So instead of offering $500,000 for the house, you can reasonably go to the seller and say, yes, I believe your house, if it had everything that I need to do a nightly rental, would be worth $500,000. But it doesn't have everything we need. I'm going to have to retrofit it with a sprinkler system. That's going to cost $35,000. I'm going to have to increase the diameter of the water line coming over to the house, which means putting in a new trench and then putting in a metal water pipe. That's going to cost me $25,000. I'm going to have to upgrade the septic system and get it in a new high-tech septic system engineered. That's going to cost me $40,000. So instead of $500,000, I'm willing to offer you $280 or something, or $380. Yeah, so let's say $380.
Great strategy. In my experience, most of the time, people who have a property like that don't even know that it's zoned to be able to use for short-term rental use. They're just selling it as residential, and that's how I've helped people get a ton of deals. Mm-hmm. But in some cases, people that have caught on, and they're like, oh, this is zoned short-term rental, I'm going to buy this and flip this. That tactic is actually one that we've used successfully because that's a lot of money, what you just described.
It is.
I know because I've done it. I bought a house over on Maddox and I put $80,000 into it. And in addition to just remodeling it for the retrofit for the sprinkler system, anytime you tear into walls or anything, you're going to find a 30% more budget than what you had planned. So, I mean, $80,000 it cost me, but I still came out ahead just because of the value that I could. Then I turned around and I started renting it, and I sold it to an investor with bookings already in it. And for them, it was great because they bought a turnkey property. But what you're talking about is an excellent strategy, and that's great advice for somebody that's looking into that.
And again, buying existing homes and using them for nightly rental, that was a strategy that I'd say people were using a lot 10 to 15 years ago. Much of that inventory of vacant single-family homes is gone, at least in the Branson area.
Right.
It's gone. So the nightly rentals that are coming online now are often new construction.
Correct.
But there are some pitfalls, some advantages, and also some disadvantages with new construction. With new construction, you know in advance that maybe you're going to have a sprinkler system as part of the home. You know in advance that you're going to have a certain septic system out back. You know in advance you have to have a water line with a certain diameter that feeding into the home, or a tank of however many thousands of gallons to operate a sprinkler system. You know all of that in advance. Where I've seen people make the biggest blunders is two things. One, entering into cost plus contracts. So they meet a contractor who's very personable. And the contractor says, yes, I have the ability to build this new home that you want, and I can build it with all the bells and whistles that you'd like. And I'm willing to do it for a cost plus contract. And people sign it. They think I sure like this contractor. They never think about the fact that as soon as your signature goes on that document, the contractor now has an incentive to inflate the costs as much as possible.
Right.
And so I've had some contractors who they had their parent contracting company, and then they created subsidiaries that would supply all the labor and materials, all owned by the same guy. And these subsidiaries would artificially inflate all the monies that were actually spent on the project because the contractor was now getting a cut twice. He got a cut not only off the cost plus contract, but now he's getting an extra cut off all the materials, off all the labor, off all the equipment rentals that flow into this building because he set up these subsidiary.
You discovered all this?
Entities. Yeah.
I mean, this has happened.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it has.
You're like,
it has
that's probably took quite a bit of investigation to figure all that out.
Yeah, it took some. So beware of cost plus contracts. There's really no need for a cost plus contract if you're building an active rental house, because building a single family home is such a standard type of construction. A contractor should know within a few $1,000s up front what it's going to cost. The contractor can actually go to a lumber yard and get preset bids on all the lumber, on the electrical, on all the plumbing that's going to go into it. You can get bids. You can lock in packages for the electrical. You can lock in at the lumber yard packages for the lumber, packages for the plumbing. So as a contractor, before you put up the first board, before you hammer the first nail in the wall, you should be able to know pretty accurately what the materials are going to cost. And if it's your crew that's doing it, I mean, you've built, 50 to 100 houses, 300 houses with that crew before, so you should know how much labor is going to take. There's no good reason that I can see for a cost plus contract.
That's true. I know during COVID, it was a little crazy that people couldn't get bids, and honestly, the market was going crazy at that time, and I was surprised at the contracts that people were signing just because they wanted some inventory. Another thing that you taught me many years ago was the terms intended use and how important that is. So in the contracts that we use in short-term rentals, we always put the responsibility on the seller, especially if they're advertising it as a short-term rental, for them to prove that it can still be used as a short-term rental. Now, as a buyer and a buyer's agent, it's still our job to trust but verify. So we do that process. We're usually the source of the source, and we have that buyer go contact that county official or person to make sure that they can do short-term rentals there. But we like to put the responsibility on the seller if they are advertising it as that and selling it as that with, fully furnished and all that. But as it pertains to new construction, if a builder is building, and I've seen this before, this has happened locally. A builder is building a property for a short-term rental, and then we find out it can't be used as short-term rental. So on that contract, it needs to say that the builder is going to build it for that intended use.
Yeah, and it's going to meet whatever local codes it has to meet to satisfy the requirements as a short-term rental. Because
we don't want the builder to say, "Oh, I didn't know you were going to use this as a short-term rental."
Exactly.
Right? So that's a conversation that needs to be had up front, and I've seen that happen in a negative way. Great advice. Thank you.
Something else I've run into is people hire a builder to construct a home for them and just assume that everything's going to go smoothly. Well, you're going to be disappointed.
Right.
And if you want the builder to put in a certain quality of finishes, certain quality of cabinets, quality of countertops, flooring, roofing material, whatever, that needs to go in the specifications. The more detailed the architectural plans, the less margin there is for error and misunderstanding.
Good communication, always. It works in marriages. It works in real estate contracts. What we've discovered is that we can sell anything that doesn't exist as long as we have, the consumer, the client, you pick the lot, you pick the floor plan, and then you know what the standard features are. And we make everybody sign off on that.
Yeah.
So here's the floor plan. And actually, before you break ground, we want the builder and the buyers to sign off on that floor plan. That's how we know that we're going to break ground. We have our standard features list, so we know exactly what comes standard with the home, and we know exactly what that buyer's selected upgrades are. And with just those documents, you can start this process. And it's amazing to me how many people don't.
Oh, that's right. Don't go into that level of detail. Right. They just say, tell the builder, build me a home of, 5,000 square feet. And here's kind of a rough sketch that I put together. And
here's a standard realtor contract that was created for an existing property, and it's not really built. Those timelines for home inspection and loan acceptance and appraisal are just way out of whack, you know. It's definitely the Wild West sometimes, but thanks for your advice. You got any other nuggets for an investor that wants to purchase real estate, use it for short-term rental, new construction?
At all possible, use an escrow company. That's certainly advantage.
For construction disbursements?
Yeah, for construction disbursements.
Or just for closing in general?
I use it for both.
For both?
Yeah. I've seen so many cases where, even just recently, people have been ripped off to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars because they went to a builder and they said, build something for me, and the builder says, okay, I'll need X number of dollars up front. So they just pay the money over to the builder before anything's constructed, before any materials are bought, and the builder just disappears. Like hundreds of thousands of dollars have been lost in this area. Probably millions of dollars have been lost in this area through people naively handing over large sums of money to builders with no accountability, no clear architectural plans, maybe no written contract, certainly no materials having been bought. You should never do that.
This is probably when you get involved in someone's life at this point.
Yeah,
right?
after the money's gone,
right?
Then they call me, and I say, "Well, what did you do?" And they explain to me what happened. And I say, "Well, in the future, if we do this again, let's use an escrow company. And once we have a good contract signed with the builder, we'll put money into escrow, and then as the builder completes different phases of the project, he can draw money out of escrow in exchange for everyone signing lien waivers saying that they've been paid in full for that stage of the project. It's so clean.
That's the only thing I liked about the past 4 years, where it was truly a seller's market. And the builders were forcing buyers to get their own construction loan and pay the interest on the build.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I really liked about that was that the buyer really had a lot of control over when those draws took place.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, the builder didn't meet their obligations and they didn't get paid,
mm-hmm.
which was a great incentive for them to keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely good advice.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So if somebody is in a situation where they're getting ready to have to rally some of their neighbors to defend their rights to do short-term rental, whether it's at a city council meeting or a county planning and zoning meeting, would you recommend that they get an attorney right away or try without an attorney?
I think it just depends on a case-by-case basis.
So what's a case where you think we'd need to get an attorney involved right away?
I think if you've gotten pushback from the county itself on whatever your project is, probably better to get an attorney involved at that point.
Okay.
If the county hasn't shown a negative reaction to you, then maybe it's okay to go in, you and your neighbors, to say, we like this idea.
Let's have a discussion.
I've seen plenty of successful applications where it was just the property owner and some of their neighbors going in and support, or some business people from the community going in support of a project. Plenty of times that's worked successfully without there being an attorney involved.
So if somebody wanted to get an attorney, what questions would you recommend that they ask that attorney to ensure that they know their stuff?
Or you could just ask them how many planning and zoning projects they handle during the year, how much construction litigation do they handle, and if they do a fair chunk, then you should be okay.
How do we know that they know the state statutes like you do?
That's one of the problems. It's very difficult for a layperson to evaluate the expertise of an attorney whom they might hire.
Exactly.
Very difficult.
I've learned a lot over the past year on, the quality of different attorneys, not just in my experience with them, but, just friends that have had issues even with family law and that sort of a thing. Mm-hmm. A good attorney is a great friend. And which is why I've always appreciated you, even regardless of what I do or what attorney team that I've got. I always like to keep you close because I really feel like you, not only do you understand the law better than most people who I've ever met, but I trust you. And a lot of times I'll have to even say this about attorneys sometimes. It's like realtors are the same way. I mean, people think we grow up with moss on our skin that we have to scrub off because we're so, dirty and greasy and slimy. And actually, that's why I became a real estate agent, was to prove that wrong. I had this conversation with somebody the other day, and they said, oh, yeah, real estate agents, I've never met, he was an investor, and he's like, I've never met a real estate agent that was really worth anything because I can just go out and find properties myself. I've heard that multiple times from investors. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you've never met a real estate agent that I have trained, because that's why I get up out of bed every day. Mm-hmm. And if you did have a real estate agent like the ones we train, your net worth would be 2 times what it is today. Mm-hmm. So I check that attitude. I challenge that attitude and go find a real estate agent that's going to really be on your power team. And I think everybody needs a really great attorney like you in their life too, because I don't know the law like you do. And so I always appreciate your expertise and your involvement. And even sometimes when I'm talking to an attorney, I still want to talk to you because I'm like, is this right? Or is this person just trying to get fees, or is this legit? So, Big Brother Tim has been involved in a lot of stuff here. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And that's not as easy to get because I don't really trust a lot of people. We've been working for the same customer in this town for many years. I just respect what you do for people.
Thank you.
Any other questions somebody could ask an attorney to determine whether or not they do you want to find somebody that specializes in government law or real estate law or both? Or
so sometimes maybe it depends on the project, but you certainly need, I think it's really helpful to have someone who does a lot of litigation.
Okay. Time in front of a judge.
It does make a difference. Just the experience of going through one case after another.
Why does that matter?
Most of my practice, even though I understood from law school, I came to understand the basics of contract and property, just understanding the nuts and bolts of how the law functions, that just comes by experience.
Interesting. Well, what's next for you, or what is exciting for you right now?
I don't know that I'm going to do much different. I continue to just practice law here in this local area. And then I make sure that I take enough breaks so I don't get burned out. It's easy for attorneys to get burned out.
How come?
Maybe because there's a lot of conflict.
Yes.
That's just inherent to what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of stress, a lot of expectations and demands from clients. So a high percentage of attorneys get burned out and drop out of practicing law.
Do they?
I've been able to avoid that, in part because I make sure I take breaks and leave the country and go off to Europe or the Middle East or Asia or North Africa, and every now and then for a few days, and then come back.
Enjoy some architecture.
Yes.
Yeah. I've found the same to be true with real estate agents. Primarily, most real estate agents were like school teachers that would quit and then get a real estate license in their twilight years just to make some money and kind of enjoy retirement and still be social around people. I was 30 years old when I got my real estate license, so I had to wear a tie and fool people into thinking I was professional, until I got to the point where I knew what I was talking about. But it was always fascinating to me how the burnout rate for real estate agents was right about 10 years. So here I am 16 years into the business. I just happen to be a red line guy anyway. I just happen to love passionate conversations, and that's kind of kept me going. Mm-hmm. It's good for my wife. She likes a passionate guy. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll get a chance to join you on one of your world trips.
Yes, that would be excellent.
That'd be great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for your expertise. I really appreciate what you do for our county and what you do for investors.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Well, a big thank you for listening to the end of our podcast. I know your time is valuable, and I hope you got a few takeaways that are going to help you get a greater return on that time. I know you will. And if you did enjoy it, I'd sure appreciate a share or a comment. Feel free to subscribe for instant access to new episodes and offers. There's also a ton of free content and ways to learn more and engage more at WorleyRealEstateNetwork.com. Until then, we'll continue to bring you recipes for success and real stories from real people who, like you, are living out your divine purpose. And hey, God loves you. No matter what happens, don't give up.